I kind of forgot what we were talking about. Could you give me a bit of a recap? You
Yeah,
were talking
well,
about the Zeitgeist, but I
so the
wonder what
piece
particularly caught your mind, caught your attention.
the piece that I loved, and like I was just saying before we started recording, that I love so much about it, is I
We are
feel like
recording the run.
we are, yeah. The we are, sorry. That's all right, Julian. You're great. Um, but it's the authenticity piece. And when you guys had your conversation, it started off, I think you began it talking about the zeitgeist. And then you guys are talking about Trump and politics and authenticity. And then at about,
Hmm.
I don't know, I'll link it. I'll put a, in the description when if we post this and I send it to Jeff, I'll put a link to your guys' combo and to the pertinent section, which I think I've revisited it so many times. I think it's 39 minutes, is when you start talking about it essentially. But it's about the reason I loved it so much is because, and you guys kind of had a back and forth, which was really great, but it was essentially the dynamic, something that's often talked over. You guys were saying how people speak past each other in these things and kind of the difference between your words and your actions, but true authenticity has a cost, because you were talking a little bit about, I think, avatars and social projections, but like when you're projecting something that isn't true to yourself, there's a cost that's associated with that. And and I think that really authenticity and honesty, the thing that's always most resonated with me about Jordan Peterson, and this whole phenomenon is the authenticity bit. And the Dostoevsky, like, above all, do not lie, especially to yourself, because or when Jordan Peterson said that, like, if you lie to yourself, you're essentially polluting or messing up your own, the organ, your internal organ that allows you to correct and reorient itself toward the good, essentially. And honesty is always really related to me, and I love your guys' conversation about that. So I mean, if you guys just have any thoughts that are popping to mind or any remembrances of that conversation, like, have at it.
Well, I think two other things that might be in the back of your head too might be the Paul Vanderklay video on authenticity. With I think this was on the Folks. What was the guy's company called? Do you have any
Kinfolk.
idea? Kinfolk. Yeah, I think maybe you're thinking of that as well. And
Yeah,
you
no,
had
that
some interesting. There was some interesting conversation on our little Voxer thing a while back where you were talking about authenticity and truth. Um, and I think this was in context of the Reddit link deconstruction about how someone who is able to sort of make that honest, come to this honest place of this is what I feel is true, even if what the person arrives at isn't true, he's in a better place than he was when he was believing something that isn't that what maybe was true, but it doesn't match up to his authentic self.
right.
And this makes me think of something Kierkegaard said about the guy who worships an idol with this absolute um, inner truth, I guess you could say, this inner ferocity, this inner genuine worship of this false idol is in a better shape than this hypocritical Christian who just sort of doesn't care that much, but he's worshiping the true God, so to speak. So there's a similar gap there between you're able to believe the right things falsely and believe false things truly. So
Hmm.
that maybe that
When
I think,
Matt Allison and I were talking, one of the things we ended up hitting on was how Christianity seems so basically to be an anti-sentimental religion. So when you look at the actions and behaviors of Christ, it's really pushing against this idea of turning it into the lukewarm. Sorry, Luke. This lukewarmness, right? He literally says, those that are lukewarm, I will spit from my mouth, or, I would rather you very hot or very cold.
Right.
Which is quite overtly a call to honesty. And this takes its ultimate form, of course, with the final words of Christ, right? So there is this extreme call to be authentic, because in those last words, he quite literally throws away his entire ministry, right? He's going to be honest. He's going to be authentic to what he's experiencing, even at the cost of everything his life stood for.
Yeah.
Right? That's what's happening there. Now it's recovered, but it is a legitimate throwing away. It is a legitimate, he in that moment is willing to say, everything I said is wrong. I've been forsaken. And then, of course, right, passing through that bottom point, he comes back out, and it becomes justified again. But it's not justified on a credible basis, right? It's not through, I'll sacrifice myself to the thing I said was right. It's no, I'll follow it all the way down, into the place where it no longer is true, because he's functioning again on a deep sense of what we call authenticity. So yeah, that was one aspect that we brought up there that reminded me of what you were saying there, Julian, with Kierkegaard's response that it's better to be authentically wrong, or honestly wrong, than it is to be dishonestly right.
Yeah, so I would love your guys' thoughts on this. That's a great line too from Kierkegaard that you're riffing on too, Julian. But I think a lot of where people speak past each other in this conversation is people that have a certain maybe temperament take authenticity to mean mere like subjectivism in and of itself.
You're critiquing Paul Vanderklay?
Well, I don't know exactly. There are times when Paul talks about authenticity. I think it really just comes down to semantics and what you mean by it. There's times he talks about authenticity disparagingly, and I just, what I understand to be authenticity is extremely positive, if not almost like one of the chief virtues.
It's, if I can interrupt for a second, it's like the people who dismiss Kierkegaard because he's a subjectivist, and they manage to miss the whole point. They just miss the whole point, and they try to sort of squeeze him into their frame of, okay, there's objective truth and we're seeking that, and everything else is malarkey. So he just doesn't fit into their little world.
Well, and I think also, gosh, excuse me, I'm not dying.
Good.
Oh man. I think that there's a positive and a negative side to it. And I think if we are going to create an idea of authenticity that is actually useful, we likewise have to own up to the fact that it is not a good in and of itself, right? Much like the pursuit of truth. That's a great virtue. But if you elevate objective truth to too high a level, you actually end up, it inverts on itself, right? You throw away the human in the pursuit of some abstraction that you think you are able to grab hold of. So, in many ways, they kind of balance each other, and in some sense offer value to each other. So I don't think you can have authenticity without, or a legitimate form of it, without also having a pursuit of truth. And likewise, I don't think you can have a pursuit of truth without a pursuit of authenticity. Otherwise, in either case, you end up a hypocrite, right? So I think it is proper to to look at the ways in which authenticity can fail us and how we can actually delude ourselves with the concept of authenticity. And I tried to kind of hint at that when I wrote in the Discord when you asked for commentary.
Yeah.
But right when you kind of look at the beginnings of existentialism, so in Heidegger, you know, it kind of goes off the rails once it gets into the more familiar existentialists like Sartre. Oh, that's wonderful. The neighbor is weed whacking. Heidegger. So yeah, Heidegger, one of his main ideas is he poses Dasein, right? Which is that being, the nature of our being is that our being is in question, right? We are the being whose being is in question. And what that is in many ways a call to authenticity. And you can see this, right? Again, he's also functioning largely in a secular framework. So it's really out of Heidegger that you get this secret, sacred self that Paul often talks about. And if you leave it like that without some telos, some goal to find in some way a home of being, right? If it's just forever that whose being is in question, then you do end up at a form of authenticity that is purely deconstructive. It just falls endlessly in on itself. There's no ground, right? And that Heidegger becomes a Nazi, I don't think is, like, that's the most important part of understanding his philosophy. Because what happens is in the pursuit of abject, of almost a pure form of authenticity, this solipsistic deconstruction will eventually take us to a place where our being in question no longer actually matters. And that's the will, right? You'll fall down into a power game.
Yeah.
So, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. The reason I'm bringing it up is because, you know, there's been a massive shift in the culture starting from, I mean, probably from a good while ago, but very clearly for our generation from the early 2000s. But well, even earlier, right? The grunge movement was an authenticity movement as a counter response to the 80s hyper image focus, for example. So you see a really heavy focus on authenticity. And I think when you look at a lot of the, well, right, Rhett and Link's deconstruction, or when people start deconstructing the concept of gender, or when they start, right, all these signifiers of identity start crumbling under the pursuit of authenticity, because we realize that none of the categories are able to capture whatever that authentic thing is, right? And it has if we do not form some type of telos, if we do not form some, and it can be open-ended, right? Does not have to be a closed telos. Then we do fall into this kind of solipsistic nightmare, really, endlessly questioning every way we have of understanding ourselves.
So do you think,
obviously there's a good part to that too.
So I don't know, I'm just spitballing as always. Do you think that if I understand what you're saying about deconstruction and how it can become this circular, endless thing when you don't have, when you're balancing kind of authenticity with truth or subjectivity with objectivity, and you can get in this endless pattern of deconstruction. But if there's, and I liked what you said about the, like, it can be an open-ended telos, because to me that's almost what like when Jordan Peterson talks about what religion is it's kind of that tapping into the transcendent dream, which is by nature ineffable because it's transcendent. You can't ever pin it down because it is transcendent, and religion is the thing that interacts with that. And so, I mean, what came to mind to me, what I was trying to think about, and the word that popped up was reactionary. What if you're because this is what I would propose, and I've said this to people before. I think that deconstruction in general is at least existential, intellectual deconstruction, that the kind that Rhett and Link has, is inevitable if you are in a certain pattern of knowing and belief that centers it all in a kind of telos and propositions that is static. So it's like this static way of knowing versus a being, interactive, dynamic way of knowing, because that's kind of what I think you were getting at when you were talking about an open-ended telos, because that's the way I've said that before, is you're open to the truth outside of the truth that you currently apprehend. And so like that's what I mean when I'm talking about authenticity. I'm talking about a posture of being. It's a dynamic thing that is where you're constantly open to, I mean, like a Jordan Peterson rule number 9, assume the person you're talking to knows something you don't. It's the humble realization that you cannot capture the entirety of the world and objects and facts inside your mapped left brain. You just can't do it. It's impossible. And so it's more about a posture of
hospitality.
Yeah, openness, potential. It's more of a, for lack of a better term, like feminine energy. It's the kind. I mean, I don't know. I'll keep rambling and struggling for words, but it's more of a. I feel like there are two ways that you can know, and maybe I'm universalizing my experience, but I went through a period of intellectual deconstruction, and I'm not anymore. I'm not in a mode of deconstructing at all, because I think and the way that I would say it is because I've left that kind of knowing behind. That's just not the way that I interact with the world anymore. But I think that deconstruction is inevitable if you are honest, and if you are authentic, and if you are in the kind of frame that is static and trying to map the world in like an objectivist way.
Yeah. And it is, I think, almost like a type of psychosis, where the person almost gets stuck in a cycle of building up a map, if you will, just to break it back down. And they're kind of like they're looping in this cycle, right? They can't find anything that they actually cannot deconstruct, so they just keep throwing up things and then ripping them down, and throwing up a thing and ripping it down. And that's where, again, it's like some type of telos seems necessary. And the way you describe that, I definitely agree with that. How you describe the open-ended telos, where it's more like the goal becomes not some perfect state, some perfect static state, but it's rather there's some vision of an optimal dynamic way of interacting with life, right? But it is optimal, right? There is something to it that allows you to judge that that way of being is better than this way of being.
It's like a dance. I mean, there are proper steps, but it's moving.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah. I was thinking today of, I wrote a piece a while back called A Theology of Weakness. And in it, I contrasted this, the sort of these two different ways of being a Christian. So I sort of brought in the Christmas story, and you have, Christ the baby, where you have basically God who becomes a baby. And then you have Herod, who's not impressed, because here comes this king who's going to take away his throne, and he's a threat. And I sort of take those two images, and I think about two different modes of being a Christian. This one is exactly what this Christ-like one is exactly what Luke was articulating about this sort of open posture where you recognize you're not God and you can't be God, and thank God for that. And so you're always have this sense of openness to the way I put it is so this sense of openness to the Holy Spirit to subvert your ways of thinking. So it has this renewing element. And then this other way is just like Herod. It has this preserving. It's all about preserving the power structures. It's all about preserving your way of conceptualizing reality. And I think apologetics in the Christian setting sort of functions like this. I think of it sort of as a political project. It's all about maintaining the political structure as it is now, and it's sort of it's essentially a political battle between the new atheists for who can because the sort of most rational party gets to be the cultural leader in our sort of rational society. So I guess it's fundamentally connected. The sort of sense that you have it all figured out is fundamentally connected to your maintenance of power, while the Christ who goes to the cross is fundamentally about powerlessness. And so I was thinking, there's two different modes of being. You might say that this sort of open, powerless, Christ-like way is sort of vacuous, because it's so perpetually open that what does it really stand for anything? Sort of, it might be one critique you could give. And I think there has to be this balance between openness and closeness, where you have this you're sort of submitting yourself to a way of being, to a system of belief, to a narrative that you're a part of, while also being perpetually open to allow it continuously to keep alive. So it functions very much like an organism, where it's constituted in some way that allows it to move through the world, but it's also perpetually open so that it can keep growing.
I would say that
exactly.
closeness is in the moment, right? It's in the moment of action. It's where it's not in the philosophy itself, right? It's not in the condensation of knowledge or information.
Oh yeah,
it's in the willingness to be,
to dialogue. Yeah.
It's
well, it's Abraham knew Sarah. I mean, it's a consummated act. It's like eating. When Julian was talking,
Yes.
It reminded me of people will often. So when I was going through my deconstruction, people would, truth bomb me with various things to get me off the slippery slope of deconversion, and one of them was G.K. Chesterton has a quote of saying, like, an open mind is like an open mouth. It's meant to close on something, and I mean, and G.K. Chesterton has a point, but my retort to that was always like, yes, but a perpetually closed mouth is a syndrome. It's a disease called lockjaw. It actually prevents you from eating if you have a perpetually closed mouth. And so I think that's the dynamic being thing, is that you have to, in order to eat, you have to continually open and close your mouth.
And that's literally how we create metabolic energy, right?
Yeah.
That's the beginning of the stage of re-energizing the body. Like the metaphor keeps unfolding. And
Can
also
I throw something?
Oh yeah,
sorry.
go for it.
Oh, I keep going. I had a bit of a different tack to go here. I'm wondering, Yeah, why don't I just do it? I'm wondering about the relationship between authenticity and this sort of submission to something larger than yourself, right? So think of sort of making yourself, when you become a Christian, you sort of submit yourself to this narrative that's now going to guide your actions and guide your life. But that sort of comes at the cost of authenticity in some sense, because if you were sort of following your true sacred secret self, maybe you want to go in a different direction. So you're sort of allowing yourself to be constrained while also trying to maintain authenticity within this constrained way of being. So I wonder if there's how to think about that tension between being part of something that isn't authentic right now, but you're sort of betting on the future and your development within that system. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So like kind of how do you remain authentic in a fake it till you make it
Yeah, that's an
ourselves in.
Extreme version of it. I think it's not necessarily fake it till you make it. It's sort of, I buy part of this, but I don't buy the whole thing.
Well, that's almost the fake it till you make it thing is an interesting phrase, I think, if you really think about it, because like, I don't know, this almost makes me think of, it's connected to Jonathan Edwards. Like he wrote this treatise on the freedom of the will, which is a big, like, it's like a Calvinist proof text for essentially the Calvinistic perspective on free will. But he talks about like desires, and he said you have chief desires and you have lesser desires. And his argument, which is true as far as I can tell, is that your agency is always necessarily connected to your chief desire. It can't not be. This is Jordan Peterson. The thing you value most, the thing at your top of your hierarchy, you can't help but orient to. You have to. And so like the fake it till you make it thing, I think is deceptive in that the play on words is that you're faking it. But the truth is that you couldn't actually orient to it if you didn't see it as true. You wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, exactly. It's a form of truth in itself.
Yeah, you're saying, fake it till you make it to me means like, I don't quite feel this yet, but I think I should.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a profoundly true posture. It's saying it's the same thing as saying there's not all the truth is within me. There's truth beyond me that I need to grow towards. And I think taking this posture of allowing yourself to be part of something you're not completely authentically comfortable with at the moment is another form of being in the truth. And just think of something like you don't even have to, I mean, religious examples are the best, but even something like marriage, they say sort of has to work in this sort of fake it till you make it way. You don't really feel like loving your wife today maybe, but you just can't give up on this thing you've built together because of what your authenticity tells you in the moment. Or maybe, yeah.
Well, I think it might be that we are limiting the sense of authenticity too much as almost like a kind of immediate, brutal honesty.
Or an immediate feeling.
Yes. Yeah. Or an immediate feeling. And I don't think that's... it's probably something more like, right, when you deal with that issue that comes up in the marriage, you are honest about it and you actually seek a legitimate resolution within the marriage, as opposed to, right, so you've got the problem, there's the authentic branch, which is not just like, today I don't feel like being married, so screw marriage. It's, no, there's something here that needs to be resolved. I'm going to own up to that and seek its resolution. That's being authentic. The other option is just, that's too much. If I just paste on the smile and say, I love you when I don't feel it, it'll be fine, right? And that usually, it's a Band-Aid, right? You might have a short-term fix, the peace is kept, but the spirit of the marriage starts to get eaten away the more you repeat that cycle without
there
actually
is
confronting the issue.
But there is something to that, because I've heard this said, and I've found it to be true, and I think it's true, and it's very in line with actually C.S. Lewis and the Abolition of Man, is that, like C.S. Lewis has said, if you don't love someone, act like you love them. Do things in accordance with love for them, and you will find yourself initially loving them. So like even in a marriage with your wife or something, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got is like, even when you're not feeling close to your spouse, or maybe you guys are fighting, or maybe you're having disagreements, or there's conflict or whatever, there just isn't intimacy. Little things like kissing your spouse when they leave for the day or when they get back or something like that, it can seem like a trite little empty ritual thing, but really, I mean, if you took, I will tell you this from personal experience, take stock, even if you're not feeling it, if you consistently do that, I mean, the writer isn't controlling the show as much as we think it is, you know? Like if you're consistently doing these little things towards someone, it works all kinds of miracles, because how we act is equally as much, if not more so, who we are than what we think about ourselves.
Oh, and again,
I wonder
think
if
it's... Go ahead, Julian.
Sorry. I wonder if authenticity is connected to freedom ultimately.
Can you flesh that out a little?
Well, I'm just thinking about, you know, the what we were just discussing about, you know, the authenticity of submitting to something that you feel is true, but no, that you don't feel is true, but you know is go. How do you put it? the submitting to something larger than yourself,
Yeah.
which you don't feel comfortable at the moment, but you know it's the best thing for you in the long term. This is the real form of freedom, where you're unfolding your true self to become who you actually are made to be, so to speak. Whereas the other type of freedom is just this pure sort of random arbitrary choice, with no rationality connected to it.
Well, yeah, that almost reminds me of, do you remember when Paul a while back played in one of his videos? It was maybe at the beginning of the Lincoln Rhett thing, but he played, or he just brought up a little bit that Michelle Williams acceptance speech. So like she won an award. She's an actress, brilliant actress. I actually like her a lot, but she won an award for some movie. I'll send it to you guys and we can maybe put it in the notes, but it was, the whole thing was just about like, it was almost like a political play for women and freedom of choice, and they're panning to women in the crowd who are just crying. But like, if you just go and read the comments in this YouTube video, it was just about how she was essentially saying like her ability to choose to sacrifice her child or choose when to have her children was like her, I don't know, she was just you know, putting this in this place of value, like it was such an ultimate thing. And it's essentially like what you were talking about, is like, is your perceived ability to choose between options the ultimate good? Like, is that ultimately what freedom is? Is that the best thing of freedom, is the ability to choose between A and B, or to choose the right thing?
That, I think, so we're about to run out of time. I'd be down to load up another. Okay.
Yeah.
I think why freedom is so important to authenticity comes back to the idea that authenticity is felt as a kind of synchronization between the conscious register. It's when the elephant and the rider are both moving as one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can't do that if you do not have the freedom to consent to, in some sense, what the elephant is doing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you need that ability, almost a reflexive gap, in order to be on board. And it's interesting, right? Because that same gap is what will kind of screw us over. It'll give us a false sense of authority that we don't actually hold. So again, you get these really weird ideas where it's like the freedom to submit ends up being the legitimate freedom, not the freedom to exercise the will.
Yeah. All right. So Nick, you were just finishing up some thoughts on freedom and authenticity, essentially saying like it's the freedom to submit versus the freedom to choose, and the elephant and the right are lining up, and all that stuff.
Can I say something?
Please.
Okay, so I was watching Paul's video, and I was really intrigued by his thinking of authenticity as connected to the social situation you're in, where you sort of feel most authentic when you're sort of socially aligned with the group you're a part of. And I wonder if is that sort of what we mean by false authenticity, and what are we talking about when we say authentic? It's the sort of authenticity where I feel authentic when I'm feeling the same way as everyone else does and thinking the same things. Is that true authenticity? I don't think so. You started the conversation out with this example of Jesus, where he's so authentic to the point of absurdity on the cross, where that's the sort of model of authenticity I'm thinking of. But yeah, I wonder if that social dimension is something that we can integrate into how we think of authenticity, or if that's something that constitutes false authenticity.
Well, this gets at, I think, when people speak past each other using authenticity all the time. And like what I was saying earlier, and how some people can talk of authenticity disparagingly, like you're being authentic to your true secret self, of kind of like the expedient, whatever you feel like you need in these expedient feelings, more so than like this true alignment to the good. And I think a lot of that stuff has to do with temperament, because even I remember that section of what Paul was talking about in the kinfolk thing, where he was saying we feel most authentic when we're aligned to the group. And I was like, not me.
Yeah.
Like I usually feel most authentic when I'm set in stark contrast to the group.
Maybe there's another group though that you're aligning yourself with.
Well, I don't know. And I mean, and maybe it's just because of like that frame is coming, it's just maybe coming at it different, because I don't, so like within Orthodoxy, for example, you know, I transitioned from evangelicalism to Orthodoxy. I don't necessarily feel more authentic just because I'm in a group of people who hold to similar beliefs propositionally and also view the world similarly. I mean, that's nice. But my authenticity kind of has nothing to do with them. But I think that says more about me than what authenticity means. And I think that's just because I'm more prone to be an individualist. I'm always prone to see the thing that nobody's seeing. And so like my very nature is going to usually be set up in contrast to whatever group I'm in. Like that's just how I am. I'm just like, I feel no, and Paul said this actually recently, like his most recent talk, I loved it. I commented and he like thumbs upped it or loved it or something, but he said something essentially like, you know, if you just want, you know, someone to come in and say all the same thoughts that you have, and we can all raise our hand and feel good about having all the same thoughts, well then this isn't going to be that. And I was just
where my mind went too.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was just like, no, I'm not that way at all. Like I'm much more interested in having conversations with people who, so this is where it's tough, right? I love having conversations with people who are going to challenge me and help me to see the things that I don't currently see. I don't have much interest in having conversations with people who are where we're just going to be sitting in a group. I think there's value in that, where you're just reinforcing things. Like that's not a bad thing. Like I've heard Nick, you've talked about echo chambers before, and like amplification of sound and things, and like that can be a good thing. Like echo chambers don't have to be
It's how you
bad.
build energy. The
Right.
problem is that you're building energy for a reason, which is
Right.
to interface with the world, not
Right.
to just endlessly cycle it inside of a
Right. Right. So like if it's a closed thing, that's maybe bad, but like that doesn't have to be a bad thing. But again, that's just my temperament, you know? So, I mean, I don't know how that relates to what you were saying.
So I think there is an aspect there where it's like we want not only our affirmations of the group, but the criticisms or critiques of the group. We want our honest perception to be valued by the members of the group, and so we do get a kind of affirmation of value even in disagreement, and that affords us authenticity in a group setting.
Yeah.
And
If it's good faith, right?
Yes.
That's the thing. Like if you feel like these people love you and are for you, like that's my thing. Like if you are, this would be a perfect example. Like if either one of you guys would challenge me or criticize me, I would love it. Like I've had conversations with Trip. He said similar things, but that's because I trust you guys. Like I don't think you're playing like tribal ideological games to undercut me to win. Yeah. Like we're not having a transactional relationship where you're trying this isn't like what has Jordan Peterson called it? Like this, like he used this term when he was talking about the, so what you're really saying is conversation. He called it like a,
gotcha.
It was a gotcha, but it was like a competition. It
reminds me of there's no kind of middle ground. It's either you go all the way to my side or I go all the way to your side, but we can't sort of dialogue in the middle.
Yeah.
You're right. You have to sort of totally accept my ideology.
Right. Because it's kind of like we had a recent conversation about hell, and that's a topic that's come up on the Discord a bunch. And sometimes those conversations can be really contentious, and they can bring out a lot of negative emotion and create a lot more heat, right, than light. But yet, a lot of my closest friends don't hold the same position as I do, you know? And it doesn't bother me at all, you know? Yeah. It's just a very, I don't know.
Yeah, well, and it again with Paul's one of his more recent ones, the one where he was talking about relationships and gay marriage and stuff.
Yeah.
At one level, it can be easy to allow a kind of superficial disagreement with someone who's starkly idealized, say, into a conception of hell. Where it gets difficult is when they don't show up at your wedding because, right?
Yeah. Right.
And that's, I think, where it goes from like, oh, we're fine with disagreement, right? To like, oh, now the disagreement is making it so that I can't share, deeply meaningful aspects of my life with a person.
Right.
Because they've closed off the potential for relationship.
Well, and what's so like that feels like a different kind to me, because Paul brought up something that made me think of this too. And so I'm like, Preston Sprinkle is one of my friends, and I know he quotes this study a lot, and I've asked him about it personally numerous times, and I keep forgetting it. So I forget the reference. I'll figure it out and put it in the description, hopefully. But there's essentially like an empirical study that was done on people who identify as LGBTQ in the US. I think it's just the US. And interestingly, something like, I don't know, an extremely high percentage of them were raised evangelical or Christian. But it's something like 95% of the people, they're asked specifically, like, did you leave the church that you were in due to the church's position on whether they were affirming or non-affirming, or did you leave based on relational reasons? 95% it was relational. 95% of people that left church, it wasn't because the doctrinal position of the church.
Yeah. It was being shut out by
Yeah.
ability to relate to the people.
Right, which is why Preston has like written like his big book on the issue is People to be Loved. Like it's not an issue to be ideologically tribal about. And that's what I mean, the wedding thing is I think it's an apt example, because that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? Is like you can maybe disagree with gay marriage, but then like, and I think there isn't a right answer, I don't think, but like if someone is non-affirming and doesn't agree with gay marriage, can they go to a wedding and say, I love you and I support you as a person, even though I'm maybe not on board with this? Or do you feel that that participation in that sacramental ceremony is like a
automatic affirming of
right
what's happening?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can come down on that issue either way and be earnest, probably, but I think it's going to, you know, vary by situation somewhat.
Yeah. And again, we're doing the same thing, I think, by overly focusing on the moment of the marriage ceremony. So, right, whether you decide to show up at that wedding or not because of whatever, you know, dogma we're operating on, that's almost entirely secondary to the rest of the way in which you relate, right?
Yeah.
So you might be able to go to the wedding and wholeheartedly relate, you know, to the people, say, hey, this is not part of my doctrine, but I'm here for you, and I want you to, you know, be successful. I still love you, etc. You can also not show up at the wedding and still do all keep the relationship, the relational aspect strong. But it's like our minds focus so much on those sacramental points, because it has a way of condensing our dogma into a direct experience that we have to interface with. And I don't know, at some point it just becomes beside the point, right? You can fall either way and still find a way to properly love and care for that person.
Maybe that goes back to your Kierkegaard quote, Julian, of like, you can either, what was it? You can either like
worship truly or
worship truth falsely, or worship, no, that wasn't it.
Worship. Yeah.
Pursue truth falsely, or I don't know. It was
be in the truth falsely, or be in the truth falsely, or truly be in falsehood, I suppose.
I can't remember. We said it. You said it well earlier. Roll the tape back. Sorry.
Yeah, I did. I think what's happening with a lot of these debates is putting abstractions before people, right? It's we're forgetting that ethics isn't about these abstract principles that you're batting around and trying to figure out. It's about interacting with human beings. And I think you can have a very conservative view on sexuality and still be able to encounter a person as a person. And I think that's what that's what Jesus' message is all about. He has an ethical framework, but he's still able to dine with sinners and hang out with people he doesn't agree with, and all of that. It's about encountering the person as a person, and not as an abstraction, as this category of you're a homosexual, or you are a sinner, or you are a X, Y, and Z. And I think part of the problem here is, I was saying this on Discord a while back, just to make this specifically Christian. I think the church's inability to, you mentioned the 95% who left for relational reasons. I think part of the church's inability to deal with the issue of same-sex marriage or homosexuality or sexuality issues is because of the church's because we connect so many of these issues with our attempts to maintain cultural power, and these are these issues are for us political issues. Same-sex marriage is just an example of the church losing its cultural power. So homosexuals become, on this way of looking at the world, where it's all about maintaining your power, fundamentally a threat to your very mode of being, right? Because when you see a homosexual, this is a person who is undermining, the traditional sexual ethics. This is a person who's undermining your cultural power. So it's impossible to encounter them as just a person, rather because you're sort of seeing them as proxies for these larger culture wars. And I think if you come away from this perspective of maintaining your power, maintaining your own tribal status, maintaining your essentially maintaining your own power, then it becomes much easier just to interact with a human being as a human being.
And to be fair, that's definitely present. And I would say on the other end, though, that there's some aspect of preserving sacraments to keep their inward perception as sacred, right? Like, you don't want random people handing out the wafers and wine, because doing so actually eats away at our ability to enact the sacredness within the ritual.
Yeah,
so
it's like centers and fringe, right?
Centers and fringe.
So like the Peugeot idea of that there are because somewhat what we're talking about is like excluding or including, being inclusive and including the fringe in a relational dynamic, and not excluding them based off of like one term labels, not like interacting with them, as Julian was saying, in your power dynamic of like, this is an other, we have to exclude them to maintain this. And so it becomes a little bit of a Taoist yin and yang of like, there is some sense of like order, and Peugeot talks about these things all the time. Like there is a center and there is a normal, and there's the clowns and the monsters on the periphery, and like what kind of a relationship do you want to have with that? And like whether or not, no, this isn't saying anything about like the morality of homosexuality, but like it is, and this will probably trigger some people, but it is not normal. I mean, you have to call it not normal. Like heterosexuality is
by
normal
definition. It's
and so like
the norm
it's just
is 98%.
right. No matter how you look at it. And so I think it's a balance though of like I've said recently, I said this to Preston a long time ago, but I said a conservative impulse is to want to exclude and deny the outliers. They want to just like pretend like they don't exist and just get them out of here. And then the new kind of liberal, air quote liberal, progressivist impulse is to want to normalize the fringe,
bring them in.
Bring them in and make them like, and say like, no, they are normal. Well, no, they're not normal. By definition, they can't be normal. And if you make them normal, you invert the whole thing. Yeah. And you end up with endless division, which is what we see with intersectionality. Yeah. And so I don't know if that's related somehow to Nick. What you were saying is like, you have to maintain the sacrament, to maintain the center, you have to have a standard. You have to have a normal.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and again, like we can use Christ as the example. Clearly, there's a deep willingness and desire to relate to the persons that should be in his fringe. Yeah. And he does so. But there's also a difference between how he treats those people and how he treats the apostles.
Yeah.
Right? There's still layers moving in towards the center, where there's
Right.
right, they're called to behave a different way than the tax collector, or any number of the characters that you see pop up that he interacts with. Now, that doesn't reduce his ability to interact and relate with those people, but there is more going on there than just, you can't easily fit it into like, here's the right way to deal with X situation forevermore, right? And yeah. So yeah, I think you hit on something great there with Pajot also, because it really is also through that relationship to the fringe that the center is re-enlivened. So there is clearly some way to relate to it in a way where you're neither excluding it nor just trying to normalize it. And perhaps it's just like, we don't have a way to codify that.